And it looks like we are live. So, welcome everyone to this live stream, and to those of you catching the replay, I'm very glad to introduce our guest for today. He is Dr. Gordon Nicol. Dr. Nicol completed his PhD at the University of Calgary. His thesis was entitled "The Theme of Tampering with the Earlier Scriptures in Early Commentaries on the Quran." He's the author of numerous articles, essays, and books. He's lectured around the world and has served as the director of the Center for Islamic Studies at the South Asia Institute of Advanced Christian Studies. Quite a mouthful there. Dr. Nicol, welcome. I'm very glad to have you.
Great to be here with you and your listeners.
So you've spent a lot of time on today's topic. Your 2004 dissertation was called "The Theme of Tampering with Early Scriptures and Early Commentaries on the Quran." In 2010, Brill published your "Narratives of Tampering in the Earliest Commentaries on the Quran." And then in 2016, your monograph, "The Gentle Answer to the Muslim Accusation of Biblical Falsification," was published. So this is obviously something that has captured your interest and held it for quite some time. So could you start us off with just telling us what it is that interests you about this topic?
Well, initially it was the experience of having Muslim friends who would say this quite straightforwardly to me, that the Bible is corrupt or falsified or abrogated, these kinds of statements. And I began to want to get to the bottom of that. To be able to read what the Arabic says in the Quran and to know exactly what's going on there. So that's what I did. I took 25 or so verses from the Quran that Muslims often use to back up an accusation of falsification of the Bible, and traced that through early commentaries, starting with Muqatil Ibn Sulaiman in the 8th century up to At-Tabari in the 9th century. And so between those two exegetes, I wanted to know what they found in those books. And so I got a chance to do that.
And you were going through these commentaries in the original Arabic?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
They actually, Muqatil hadn't been translated at all by that point, so it was a fresh area, fresh field for study. It was great.
Excellent. So why focus so much on Muqatil and Al-Tabari?
Well, Muqatil gives us a chance to see what some of the earliest Muslims understood about the verses in the Quran, about tampering, sometimes translated distort or alter or change. I call it tampering because in the end it has a range of meanings. But and then for Tabari, he ended a period of the earliest study of the Quran, and he brought in then many different points of view on all of these questions, and he lists them and attribute them to earlier exegetes. And so it was a nice sort of parenthesis of a period when scholars in early Islam were writing out how they understood the meanings.
So Tabari gives you diversity, and then Muqatil's early commentary, if there is development in these allegations of falsification, Muqatil possibly would enable you to detect that because you're at such an early stage of exegesis with his work. That's the earliest surviving tafsir we have. Is that correct?
That's right. That's the earliest complete extant or surviving commentary. It gives us a window into that early period, which is very important. It's about the same period that the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq was written. So these are foundational writings, and so it was great. Muqatil, as you're mentioning, was more univocal. He would say it's just this way. For example, which was the son of Abraham that he was prepared to sacrifice? Muqatil says it was Ishaq. What's the question? And then Tabari, after, now almost 300 years, said there's a lot of, difference among the exegetes on this. They don't agree. Here's, 8 or 10 that say it was Ishmael, and here's 8 or 10 that say it was Isaac. And then Tabari would give his own judgment on that, and he'd say it's actually Ishaq. So this is at the 300-year mark. This is an exciting area. Before certain doctrinal commitments were made, for example, about the inimitability of the Quran, ijaz, or things like, see, at that point, they just weren't talking about things that later became a dogma for people like Ibn Kathir. And so it's exciting to get that sort of fresh air of the first centuries of Islam.
Isaac and Ishmael is an interesting example, because now for, I would say, the vast majority of popular Muslims, it was Ishmael in Genesis 22. So there's a 180 from Makatul, who said that it was Isaac. That's very interesting. I know Reuven Firestone has assembled a number of names of Muslim commentators over the centuries, and it seems like it's pretty much fairly split between the two. But it's interesting that Makatul just flatly said that it was Isaac. So very interesting. The book you mentioned, your monograph in 2016, The Gentle Answer to the Muslim Accusation of Biblical Falsification. So that first part, The Gentle Answer, can you tell us about that approach and what the intention is behind the gentle answer?
Well, you can just come at it from the biblical side. This expression, gentle answer, comes in the Old Testament book of Proverbs, chapter 15, that a gentle answer turns away wrath. That is, if you want to discuss things in a good way, let your answer be gentle. But in the New Testament, in 1 Peter 3, verse 15, there's an instruction to, when you give an answer, give it with gentleness and respect. And so there are matters that need to be answered, that need to be discussed. They're important. They're issues of truth. They're truth claims that either are true or not. And yet, when we talk together, there should be a commitment to listening to each other, respecting each other, thinking through what the other says, and also stating what we believe in straightforward and friendly ways. We know examples of debate and discussion that get a little bit too noisy and a little bit too personal. It would be good if we could steer away from that into ways of talking about controversial issues that allow people to talk together and express what's on their heart and mind.
And when we have these discussions with Muslims, inevitably some material will enter the conversation that ultimately derives from a 19th century book, Isar al-Haq. And you discuss this book in your Gentle Answer. Demonstration of Truth, I believe, is how you translate that title. So could you explain a little bit to us about this book, why it's so important to still be interacting with it here in what is now 2021, and why this book's important?
Yeah, good question, Colin. In certain parts of the world, this book still circulates. People are still talking about it today, though it was written in the mid-1800s. And they're using it for really to sort of hit Christians over the head. It's a book that was actually very clever. You have to give it credit where credit is due. In the mid-1800s, some Muslims in India discovered that scholars in Europe were raising questions about the Bible and how it came together. We call this shorthand higher criticism or historical criticism. And they started getting those books to use in debates with Christians. And so the author of Isar al-Haq or in Arabic, Izhar al-Haq, um, who is Rahmatullah Kiranvi. He started collecting these books with a friend there in Agra, India, and together they pulled out quotes where European scholars, that is supposedly Christian scholars, were raising questions about how the Bible came together. And so in his book, he used this material, and since then, many Muslims have enjoyed using that. It's been over 150 years now, and it's still being used. And my friends in India became troubled with this book, and they said, isn't there an answer for the sorts of accusations that are coming in this book, Izhar al-Haq? And so, frankly, my friends said to me, hey, what's with you? You've had a chance to study and get a PhD. Like, what are you doing? Like, can't you help us deal with what's really discouraging for us? That is, it's discouraging our faith because it's such an attack. They read it in the Urdu language, and it's very salty. It's very insulting in its language, and they were feeling bad. So they challenged me, what about you? Why don't you use your PhD for something good? Help us out. That's finally why I did it.
This material is still alive in recent years through people like Ahmed Deedat, right? I think that's where he got a lot of his material.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, and so it's spread throughout the Western English-speaking world as well, for sure.
Yeah, that's good.
It seems in some ways similar to something like the Gospel of Barnabas, where something will enter the polemical stream and it becomes very difficult to counter, even though there's not a lot of substance. It becomes so widespread and popular and repeated that it becomes a very deeply entrenched belief for some. So that would indicate the fact that you're dealing with this book would indicate that we're seeing something like that with the demonstration of truth. I'm sorry, did you want to comment on that?
Well, just that even the Gospel of Barnabas is a little easier to handle simply because scholars are clear that there's no Gospel of Barnabas from the early years of Christianity or from the first 1,000 years of Christianity, even the first 1,500 years of Christianity. This was written by a convert to Islam who wanted to attack, and it's full of errors, even according to Islam. Whereas Izhar al-Haq, one of the things that was difficult, I'm sorry, I'm saying it in Urdu rather than in Arabic. One of the things that was difficult was it used very difficult German material that few could read, and even if you read German, difficult because it's theological German. And so how do you sort of try to unpack it and take it apart in order to answer it? This is a difficulty that comes along with Izhar al-Haq.
Interesting. Yeah, I've noticed that difficulty with German. Lots of people fluent in German have difficulty with academic German. Interesting. I can only imagine what that would look like in Urdu. So let's turn now to the Quran, Torah, and Gospel. And this may seem like an obvious question, but I'd still like to get it out of the way. Up until the 7th century, the traditional date the Quran was revealed, what do people mean when they say Torah and Gospel?
Yeah, it's a great question. In Quranic terms, it's not always clear. As you know, and your listeners know, these names come up in the Quran, Torah, Injil, and Zabur. And so people have understood those as parts of the Bible, either the books of Moses, as we call them, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the Pentateuch, some say. The gospel, it wasn't clear because it's singular, whereas we have 4 gospel accounts, and Zabur was to be the Psalms. And so what the concept was, the language of the Quran is, for example, on Injil, was that Allah sent down or sent upon Isa this book called the Injil. So there's a problem there in that, the true Injil, the true gospel, the 4 gospel accounts, aren't a book that Allah sent down on Jesus, but are rather 4 witnesses to his life. It's about his life, his death, his resurrection. And so what it means for Muslims often is that, and this comes into the polemic, there was a book like that once, but it's disappeared, or it was taken up, some say, or it's corrupt now, or it's been actively falsified. And so but what exactly is it? Because in conversation with Muslims, when Christians appeal to those names in the Quran, they're asking for an understanding. They're asking for a bridge for conversation to discuss what's in those books in order to explore the truth about God and many other things. And so this is the problem with the polemic. It doesn't allow that discussion, that peaceful, calm, thoughtful discussion that we need, because of these different accusations against the scriptures. Just to add, Colin, every time the Quran actually mentions Torah, Injil, or Zabur, it's always in the most positive and respectful terms. Never when these scriptures are actually mentioned is there any word about trouble with them. There is trouble with their custodians, that is, the people who handled them according to the Quran, but not with those scriptures themselves in these verses.
Yes, I hope that viewers pick up on that, because that's very important to keep in mind. You say that there is no verb of tampering associated with the Torah or the gospel, and given the widespread accusations of biblical falsification, that's quite a thing for the Quran not to say. That is, it's not explicitly rooted in the text of the Quran.
There definitely are verses that have these verbs of tampering or change, but never is one of those verbs in the same verse with the mention of the scriptures. When the actual name is there, or something that's clear, like the book given to Moses, right? Never in those cases is there a negative comment. So it's the interpretation of those verses that have a variety of pronouns that aren't filled out. Which book is being talked about here? Who's doing the action? These things aren't filled out. So in interpretation, the exegete may say, well, these are the Jews, and this is the Torah. That's not in the verse. This is in the exegesis.
Very interesting. And your comment is also illuminating when you describe the Quran's attitude towards the Jews and the Christians, and then towards their books. So I think Surah 5 is a good example of this. Verses 43 through 48, you get glowing endorsements of the gospel and Torah. But then verse 51 is quite a big change. It says, "You who believe, do not take the Jews and Christians as allies. They are allies of each other." So you get a glowing endorsement of the Torah and gospel juxtaposed with some criticism of the Jews and the Christians themselves.
That's a very unfortunate verse. Don't take Christians and Jews for friends. If you have Muslims in your audience, I just like to say, as a Christian, I never feel that way that I can't take you as a friend. In fact, my scripture encourages me to take you as a friend. It doesn't allow me to see you as an enemy or to hate you. So I'm sorry that these verses are there, because many Muslims seeking to be faithful have taken them literally and said, hey, I just won't relate to non-Muslims. It's
That certainly closes any attempts to have a peaceful discussion, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I want to go back to something you said earlier, because this is something I see a lot. A response to what the Torah and Gospel are in the Quran is, we could put it as maybe a historical phantom. They appeared at one point, and then they're gone. We don't know where they went, but whatever the Quran is talking about, the Torah and the Gospel are no longer here. So whatever the Quran is affirming, it's not the Torah and the Gospel that Christians and Jews know of. Is such an explanation supported by the Quran? Or does the Quran present the Torah and the Gospel as something that exists in history, that existed in the 7th century, and that are there for the Christians and Jews to reference?
Yeah, that's something that we should get clear. And what does the Quran say about that? Great question. You see, there's never any kind of expression like the original gospel, the uncorrupted gospel, the gospel that has disappeared. It never appears. That expression never comes into the Quran. The mention of those words is always positive, and there's a feeling in some verses that if you want to know the truth of what's going on with this preaching or discussion, ask those who recited before you. Ask the people of the book. Ask the people who have those books. There's a feeling in the Quran and in much of the literature in the whole history of Islam that these scriptures are physical, intact, and there's even Arabic expressions like they're with them, right? Or between their two hands, right? That's tactile. That's something you can even feel. It's a description in the Quran of scriptures that are conceived of as being present, as being able to check, and as being intact. And so these theories of the gospel disappearing, not being the original gospel, those come from outside. Those come from polemic, not from the Quran. At least that's my reading. I'm glad to be corrected, but this is what I've learned from the way that the Quran talks about the pre-Islamic scriptures.
So is it fair to say from Surah 7:157, you mentioned being something tangible, a book that you can hold.
Yeah.
Surah 7:157, those who follow the messenger, the prophet of the common people, whom they find written in their Torah and Gospel. Is this another fairly strong indicator that the Torah and Gospel, the Quran sees them as being written down in the 7th century?
I'm glad that you brought up that verse, because here they're named in the same verse, right? And I just looking at it here in the commentary. This is an indication that they're present, because the verbs there are imperfect. So in Arabic, you have a past and you have an imperfect that is present and future. And so it says in the verse you quoted that it's written there with them, right? This is in the present. Whom they find written in their Torah and Gospel. Now, this raises a very important question. It seems in this verse certainly, but in the Quran and in Islamic life generally, there was a great interest in seeing that the Bible prophesied the coming of the messenger of Islam. I hope you don't mind, and your listeners, instead of saying Muhammad too many times, I just like to say the messenger of Islam, but that's what I mean, okay? So there was a need for attestation, that is, something from the past that could vouch for, that could give a stamp on something that's coming as fulfillment of prophecy. And so there was a great search in the early centuries of Islam to find any kind of part of the Bible that could be then read as a prophecy or a mention of the messenger of Islam. And this led to two things. You can imagine what discussions were like. The Arab conquerors are spreading out through the Middle East. They're meeting active communities of Christians and Jews, and they're saying to them, perhaps, hey, you know, our messenger, our prophet, you can find written in the Torah and Gospel. Well, who has the Torah and Gospel? Who knows Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic and Syriac? Well, it's the Christians and Jews. And so there's an answer back. Wow, we've read the Bible. We know it well. We didn't find anything like that at all. So where does that go then? Are they lying? Or is it true? And if it's true, then what's the next step? And this comes in many of the commentaries and much of the polemic of the first centuries. If it's not there, right? Because the Muslim preacher can't read Hebrew or Greek to see. If it's not there, you must have taken it out.
Mm-hmm.
You must have taken it out. So this is, I think, how some discussions actually went from conqueror to the conquered in many parts of the Middle East in the early centuries of Islam.
And when we're looking at verses, I'm doing that. Not sure why. When we're looking at verses like 7:157, with the Torah and the Gospel, just to return to the historical question, the Quran's conception of the Torah and Gospel is something that's there. It's between their hands. It's enduring. When you look at the commentators, like Muqatil and Al-Tabari, when they see Torah and Gospel in the Quran, are they imagining a written book? Are they imagining the written scriptures of the Jews and the Christians? Or do they appeal to something that was there at some point that vanished, like perhaps we hear from modern Muslims?
Good question. Muqatil and a few others, their way of interpreting the Quran was to tell stories. We call it a narrative kind of exegesis. It's much easier to read, for one thing, if your Arabic isn't really strong, but it's more interesting. It's about people interacting, and the scene is often the messenger of Islam and the leaders of the Jews in Medina. The Sirah has a big section of this encounter of the messenger with the Jews of Medina. And I'll give you an example. This is the interpretation which most of the commentaries give on Maida 541. 541 is the last of 4 verses that use the Arabic verb harrafa, which makes the verbal noun tahrif. And so what's the meaning of this verse, says Muqatil and many others. Tabari tells this story probably 5 times in different versions. It's that there were a couple that had committed adultery in the Jewish community. And so the leaders brought them to the messenger of Islam for a ruling. What should we do with them? Hoping for a not very difficult punishment. And so the messenger of Islam went to the Jewish study center in town, called out the one who knows the Torah better than anyone else, and said to a fellow named Ibn Surya, now you tell me, isn't the punishment for adultery in the Torah stoning? And Ibn Surya says, yeah, it is. And he says, we wouldn't like to tell you that, but that's what it is. And one of the stories, one of the versions of the story in the Sirah is that the book was actually there. A physical book was in the scene, right? And one of the rabbis put his arm on top of the book so that they wouldn't see the so-called verse of stoning, right? And a convert to Islam named Abdullah ibn Salam came and knocked that arm off, and there the verse was. Now, what does this story say? It doesn't say that there was no book. The book was there. And it doesn't say that the book was corrupt, because the verse was there. It was a matter of concealing. And in the verses of the Quran that tell about dodgy or questionable treatment of the Torah by Jews, in those verses, this is one of the really important facts, that it was there in the scene, and there's nothing in the verse, even in the commentaries, that say it was already corrupt somehow.
Fascinating. So in your book, The Gentle Answer, you have chapter 2, which is entitled The Quran's Respectful View of the Bible. And we've discussed a lot of this, and I'd like to just kind of summarize some of what we've covered so far before we get into a specific example of a verse that's been used to argue from tampering. So you said none of the tampering verbs are associated with the actual Torah and Gospel. The Torah and Gospel, according to the Quran, are something there that are present at the time of its recitation. You mentioned the imperfect verb form in Surah 7:157, and even these early commentators are imagining a Torah that's intact, and they're relying on the assumption of an intact Torah to validate some of their arguments, like in the story that you shared. Anything else, kind of big picture, that you would add regarding the Quran's respectful view of the Bible?
Well, even this search to find some kind of attestation, some kind of vouching for the messenger of Islam from the earlier scriptures is actually a compliment to those scriptures, isn't it? Some of the scholars, so like John Wansbrough, said, how could the new claims be measured? How could they possibly be measured except from what was already there? And there's a great respect for the Torah, for the Injil as books from God, and that this would be the only, like, where else would they be able to find, sort of support for the new teaching, for the prophethood of the messenger of Islam? It would have to be from what's already there. And so that in itself, we need to see as a very high view of those pre-Islamic scriptures. And as I said, many made huge efforts to find in those scriptures anything that could be interpreted as referring to the messenger of Islam. Even Ibn Hazm, who after 400, 500 years wrote a stiff polemic against the Bible, even he wrote about these scriptures, which he said mentioned the messenger of Islam. And so this is a huge compliment to them, and it's holding them very high.
Absolutely. That's Ibn Hazm illustrates the conflict of both affirming that Muhammad is in the Bible, but then also affirming that the Bible is corrupt. It's a very interesting set of views that seem to conflict, that some Muslims hold as being in harmony with each other.
It does conflict. The way he resolved this, and a few others as well, said, yeah, most of it is corrupt, but Allah protected these verses out of the whole Bible so that there could be a witness to the messenger of Islam. Does it sound likely? But this is what Ibn Hazm finally said about that conflict.
So let's get into a specific example of a verse that's been used to argue for tampering. This is Surah 279, and I'll just read the verse. So, woe to those who write the book with their own hands and then say this is from God, in order to sell it for a small price. Woe to them for what their hands have written, and woe to them for what they earn. So let's start with what the verse does and does not say that you think are important and relevant to this conversation. What does the verse say and what does it not say?
Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing this up, because these are the verses that have been used perhaps most frequently to make an accusation of corruption or falsification against the Bible. And what it doesn't say, first of all, right? It doesn't say what the book was. It mentions kitab, a book. It doesn't mention who the actors are, right? There's no Jews mentioned here. It's at the end of a long story about the children of Israel, before verse 75. So one could say, well, it still means that, but it's not in the verse. So the commentators said these are the Jews. They're the ones that that made that very clear for the reader, right? So that's what it doesn't say. It says they write the book with their hands, and woe to them. So which book is this? And of course, the commentators, most or many of them said, this is the Torah. These are the Jews. Writing things in the Torah, writing their own Torah, in order to have their own opinions or their own legal rulings. Sometimes people say in their own book and call it the Torah. Again, we said earlier, who's reading? Very few people are reading at this time in the 7th century, and very few Muslims would read Arabic. There may be some converts that could read it, but very few would read Arabic. So what actually is this about? But what it does say, though, this expression, writing the book with their hands, this seems to be the trigger of the strongest accusations of falsification against the Bible. It's exactly this, to write a book with your hands and then say, this is from God, right? And then to sell it. They've written something with their hands, they're selling it, and they're claiming that it's from God. This is what the verse does say. And I think you'll shift over to 378 later on. This is the same kind of language that again seems to trigger a really harsh accusation against the Bible.
And so when you looked at Makatel and Al-Tabari, is it possible to summarize their exegesis of this verse?
Certainly, yeah. So that comes in Narratives of Tampering, where I detailed, and you're right, exactly what it says is important. It's not, Colin, it's not a general statement against all the things in the Bible that Muslims perhaps don't believe, right? It's not about Son of God, right? It's not about the death of Jesus. It's about the messenger of Islam. So both Muqatil and Tabri say it's the Jews of Medina. It's the messenger of Islam talking with them. It's the Torah. And what they're changing, or what they're tampering with, however that's understood, what they're tampering with is the alleged description of the messenger of Islam in the Torah. This is important because when we want to come to terms with this accusation, and it's been the biggest accusation, it's been the biggest polemical point in the history of Islam with Christians, we need to know what these early books are saying. And they're saying the problem was about the messenger of Islam. The Jews didn't want to acknowledge him, didn't want to accept him, didn't want to affirm him. And so they wanted to change a description, an alleged description that was there in the Torah before the messenger of Islam appeared. But when he appeared, the Jews saw that this man was not from Isaac, he was from Ishmael. And so they strove to change what was in the Torah about him. And some say they erased, some say they changed or tampered with. This is, it seems to me, where the harsh physical accusation starts. It's not about any teaching in general or any Christian belief in general. It's about mainly that idea that an alleged description of the messengers of Islam was somehow tampered with. So it's no longer there to be read clearly and to prove that the messenger of Islam is a true prophet and that his recitations come from God.
So this reflects perhaps something you said earlier, this very early primitive stage in polemic when the question is the messenger of Islam in the Torah and gospel? As the Islamic empire expands, increasingly the answer becomes no. And so the commentators use Surah 279 to fit this very specific problem of where is Muhammad in the prior scriptures. So it looks like a very primitive early stage in the polemic when the question is specifically about the messenger of Islam. Whereas now this has expanded to wholesale falsification when many people look now at verses like Surah 279 and 378. So there's been some development then, certainly.
That's right. At this early stage of Quranic commentary, there are indeed accusations of falsification. There's no doubt about it. But they concern that one thing. Some may say the commandment of stoning. Some may say that, but the stories say that actually wasn't a problem in the Torah. But their main point was seeking for attestation to their messenger and to have the stamp of approval from the past, from these great scriptures to their messenger.
In your book, The Gentle Answer, you give some examples of the alleged physical descriptions of Muhammad that were erased. And some of them are extremely detailed. Hair, color, eye color, height, and so forth. One thing that struck me is it raised the question of just general familiarity that these authors have with the Torah and with the Bible as a whole, because any informed reader of the Bible knows that physical descriptions of characters are only mentioned when they're relevant to the story. So the hair of Samson, the hair of Absalom, the strength of Samson, the height of Goliath, and so forth. But to have a messenger or a prophet described in the Bible in such detail as some of these Muslim authors said Muhammad was in the Torah seems very out of touch with the general nature of the Torah. So can you comment on what you think the familiarity level was of some of these authors like McConnell and Tabari with the actual text of the Torah and Gospel?
Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing us back to that question, because we need to say a bit more about that. It's true that during the first centuries of Islam, there was very little knowledge among scholars and ordinary people alike about what was actually in the Torah, that is, actually reading the Torah. The Quran itself has a few verses that seem to echo wordings in the Torah. You know, the eye for an eye, for example. You mentioned Surah Maida. And I think there's even something about a camel through the eye of a needle. And so these are echoes. Perhaps somebody heard it, and so it's made its way into the Quran. But other than that, there seems to be very little knowledge in the Quran of what is written in the pre-Islamic scriptures. So there's many stories, as you know, many stories about Moses. Let's take that, and a lot of detail, a lot of content, and yet at no point does one think that this is exactly like it is in the Torah. And there are details in the Quranic tellings of these stories that are unaccountable. For example, that with the golden calf and the worship of the golden calf, and Moses comes back and talks to the people and said, "Why did you do what you did?" They said, "It's the Samari, it's the Samaritan." Like, what's that about? So from no known source, suddenly it's there in the Quran. And there's no sense of maybe checking with the Torah to see how the story goes. Not in the Quran. There seems to be an overhearing of stories and a retelling of those stories, but no actual close knowledge of what's in those stories. So Ibn Hazm was famous for actually getting to know what was in the Torah and reading it in translation. But there were very few before Ibn Hazm that did that kind of homework before talking about the Torah and the Gospel.
It's a very interesting question, because I've looked a lot at the stories in the Quran, and of course, many scholars have noted over the centuries the very close parallels to rabbinic literature. And then, of course, increasingly, scholars are seeing the close parallels with Syriac literature. And it is very curious that the Quran does not actually mention these as sources, but it mentions the Torah and the Gospel. And so it's a very interesting question to ask what the Quran's conception of Torah and Gospel actually are.
Mm-hmm.
And you, McConnell's commentary on Surah 279, you mentioned something that you call in your book a timestamp with respect to the Jews of Medina. Can you explain what you mean by timestamp and why that's important?
Okay, thank you. The idea of a timestamp on, say, a carton of juice. You know, you don't want to drink it after, when it's expired and it's gone off. You see, if you have stories about the Jews changing the Torah when they saw the messenger of Islam, right? Then you're talking about the 7th century. It's a timestamp. If this is your idea of falsification, that it happened in response to the appearance of the messenger of Islam, that can be tested. How? Well, you can see before the 7th century and you can see after the 7th century. Now, until relatively recently, we didn't have this great collection of manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls in BC, in before Christ, all the way through to the present day. But now you can take these manuscripts of Old Testament and New Testament in Greek, like the Septuagint, or in Hebrew, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you can compare them with the texts of these books after the 7th century. And you can ask the question, did they change during the 7th century? Are there any verses in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are now 800 years before Islam, that mention somebody coming that then are not in the texts after the 7th century? You see the timestamp? And so it's a good way of testing. And this is what I do in the gentle answer. I just calmly review these manuscripts, and they speak to this question. And so I would think that Muslim friends as well, if this is an accusation that you like to make, why not check whether it has actually any grounds? We're talking now about history, about science, about physical things, manuscripts, wordings. These are all things we share, whether Quranic manuscripts or biblical manuscripts. It's not a biased or, it's anyone can operate in that territory in a scholarly way. And so this is the timestamp, Colin. If, as the early commentators say, the Jews changed the Torah after seeing that Muhammad was from Ishmael rather than Isaac, we can check exactly whether that's true or not.
And this theory that the biblical manuscripts were changed was unfalsifiable even at the time that Isar al-Haq was written. And so that's something that's been changed with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in your book, you go through, okay, we have, up until the 7th century, we have manuscripts of the Bible in all of these languages spread over all of this geographical area. And like you said, McCaughill's theory, his exegesis and Tabri's exegesis of Surah 279 and other verses is eminently falsifiable now. We can actually look at these manuscripts and say, okay, were these Jews successful in changing the Torah? Did they change all of the manuscripts and so forth? And so it's very easily falsifiable. And this is, as I said, I think a big difference in polemics in the 20th century because of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We can't simply claim that McCaughill's exegesis is valid because we have manuscripts that show that it's not the case.
Yeah, it's an important point that you raise in having a conversation with Muslim friends. You see, the accusation actually came from you to us. This is what happened in the 7th, 8th, 9th century. We'd never heard this before, Christians and Jews. It came to us from you. And we're simply trying to answer that in a way that's friendly and looks for conversation, looks for friendship. It's not, okay, now we have these new facts, we're going to beat you over the head. It's crazy. Why would we want to do that? We'd like to read the contents of the gospel and the Quran sitting together and discuss them. That's what we're about. In this case, what happened is that Rematullah Keranvi wrote his book in the mid-1800s. The famous debate with missionary C.G. Fander was in 1854. And 10 years later, as we understand, the Izhar al-Haq was published in Istanbul. And at that time, there were a number of very important manuscript discoveries that hadn't yet been made, simply because people couldn't move freely around the Middle East with the Ottomans ruling it. And so French scholars, German scholars, other scholars started traveling in that area and finding manuscripts. And the number of manuscripts that have been discovered since that book was written is just unbelievable. In papyrus, in skins of goats. What's the word for that now? Parchment. And that's what I based this timestamp idea on. And so, the Sinaiticus Codex was discovered after. And suddenly scholars had so many biblical manuscripts that they could use to check exactly what we're talking about. Was there a change? What is the best reading? How can textual criticism, to take manuscripts that show differences and to use them to determine the original wording. This is all since the time of Rematullah. But this is something that Muslims and Christians share, Colin. It's we scholars can look into both biblical manuscripts and Quranic manuscripts, and there's some huge discoveries of Quranic manuscripts in the past few decades as well, right? This isn't something where we oppose each other. This is something that we can share as we search for the truth, and then we can have a conversation on our scriptures that the present polemic doesn't allow, because we're saying it's all corrupt and falsified, and we can't use it. No, we can use it, and we should.
You give a list of false assumptions in a gentle answer, and I want to bring one up as we wind things down and get your response to it. This is one I hear a lot. You list a false assumption. If biblical accounts tell of the sin of the prophets, the Bible must be corrupt or falsified. I hear this very frequently. Lot would be a good example. What happened with Lot and his daughters in Genesis 19. So what are your thoughts on that false assumption?
Yeah. The assumption is based on the teaching or the doctrine or dogma that prophets don't sin. Now, when did this develop? There's been some very good studies of this in the history of Islam. And we understand it was in the 3rd century of Islam, so 200, 300 years down the road, that the scholars of Islam developed this doctrine that prophets don't sin. But is it so? So if we, as you said, Colin, if we look in the Old Testament, read about Lot and Noah and Moses and David, we find stories that show them sinning. And the Torah and the Old Testament are very straightforward about this. They sinned. They did terrible things and they needed to repent. This is simply what is written in the oldest accounts about these characters that we have, going back to the Dead Sea Scrolls of now 2,200 years ago. These are the stories. So what about the Quran? Does the Quran support this dogma? Well, in many of the stories in the Quran, from Abraham on through, the Quran has these characters asking forgiveness. Now, if you ask forgiveness, does that mean you're sinless? No. In many of these stories, what they did is clear. In other cases, what they did is not clear, like with David. David doesn't give, the Quran doesn't give a very clear story for David about this. But it still says he asked forgiveness. So is this dogma, is this teaching that developed, say scholars, perhaps 200 or 300 years down the line, is this doctrine true? And according to the Bible and according to the Quran, it is not true. Except for one. The Bible says that Jesus was without sin. And it says it very clearly. In fact, Jesus, it quotes Jesus saying, if any of you finds that I'm sinning, and you can prove it, like, do it. I'm here. And so the teaching of the gospel is indeed this teaching that he did not sin. That's why we say this was the perfect sacrifice for the sins of the world. The only one who had no sin took on our sin and died in our place, taking the punishment that we should have. And so this discussion, Colin, really is a good discussion for us to have because it leads to many truths. And it leads to the truth of the gospel about a perfect, sinless, like a lamb without blemish, a perfect, sinless person taking on our sin and dying in our place. So it's a good topic, isn't it, Colin?
It is. And if we want to introduce Muslims to that gospel story, we would want them to read the Gospels. As we wind things down, could you tell us why Muslims should accept the biblical portrayal of Jesus against the Quranic portrayal of Jesus?
Certainly. Let's take one aspect of the story of Jesus to discuss, because for us it's perhaps the most important, and that is, did he die or not? Did he die or not? Now, the understanding of many of you listening is that he in fact didn't die. And, I respect you giving so much importance to truth that you'll make the best case that you can for what you believe about this. But there's more than just our opinions on this. Let's start with the Quran. The Quran mentions the death of Jesus, just mentions it in 3 verses. And in those 3 verses is a tremendous amount of confusion. It's not at all clear what they mean. And the Arabic itself is almost impossible to translate. Like the expression, shubaha lahum, or mutawafika. These are expressions in those verses that are tough Arabic. And so what do they say finally? They leave the reader in doubt. Should the word of God leave people in doubt about this important, what for Christians is a fact? So when we go over then to the gospel, we have a 4-fold gospel, that is 4 witnesses to the life of Jesus. That is, they're reporting what people actually saw and heard. You have 4 accounts that work together to form the basis of a fact. And if you're inclined not to believe them, what do others say? So there are non-Christians in the area who also report the death of Jesus. That would take Colin some time to talk about. But you're looking at the witness of Scripture, the Injil, which is the good news about Jesus, and you're looking at any other witnesses because the history of this event is important. This, according to the gospel, this is how God shows his love to the world. So without that, how can you know? Without that, there's no actual event in history that shows you his love. He loved the world, God loved the world so much that he gave his son, right? And so when we talk about love, we're talking about something that took place in history, so we can be assured that he loves us and that we too will rise as Jesus rose from the dead at the end of time.
In this, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world. And so Muslims, if you miss out on the Son and what happened with Christ, then you miss out on the manifestation of the love of God. Dr. Nickel, I've gotten some emails as we close saying, should I get this? And this is the Quran with Christian Commentary, a guide to understanding the scripture of Islam. And my answer is yes, you should get it. It's a great resource. I reference it. And before we go, I'd just like you to introduce our viewers to your commentary. And I'll probably have to have you back sometime later on to talk about this more. But could you introduce our listeners to your Quran with Christian Commentary?
Sure. A few years ago, a publishing company gave me this opportunity to write as a Christian on the verses of the Quran. And that was a great adventure and just a tremendous learning experience. So yeah, the book is this one. And so what I did was to go from first verse to last and make comments, especially at the points that would be interesting to Christians and Jews and non-Muslims. But I made many comments. So it's organized as a sort of a study Bible, that you've got the text of the Quran above and comments on the verses below. And so I thought, if Christians are going to talk with Muslims about the Quran, they should make the effort to get to know it. And so this was a great chance for me to do that and also to share that with other readers. This is a privilege to be able to study these things together. It's a privilege for us to read what's in the Quran. And, our wish is that you would read what is in the Bible, especially the gospel accounts, so we can talk about it together. We're quite happy to read the Quran, even in Arabic, to learn Arabic in order to do it. Friends, this means that we respect you. We respect what you believe. We respect your convictions. We respect your zeal. And we want to talk with you about the kinds of questions that come up between us in a friendly and a comfortable way.
And for those of you who like electronic resources, the Quran with Christian Commentary is available on Logos as well. You can check out more of Dr. Nickel's work in the description box. There are links there to books and other articles and essays that he's written. Gordon, it's been a real pleasure having you on with us. Thank you so much for being here.
It's been great to be here with you. I know you have a really great number of subscribers and people that check out your videos. And thanks for inviting me to share with you and with them.
And a big thanks to everyone out there watching, and a thanks to my Patreon supporters as well who make this channel and interviews like this possible. I'll see you all next time.